All right, I think we can get started. It's just about 5 minutes past 6 Pacific time. So welcome everyone to this webinar virtual talk. My name is Mira Mosini and I am the Training and Equity Facilitator at Living Yoga. We're so thrilled and excited to host Dr. Shreena Gandhi for her talk on yoga, cultural appropriation, and structural racism. Before I introduce Shreena, I just wanted to draw your attention to this slide. Most of you have probably already read it, but I just wanted to let you know that we will be recording this talk, and we'll have a link available to this talk at some point this week, I assume, and we'll be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered with that link. So because we are recording the talk, we wanted to be mindful of people who don't want to be recorded. So feel free to, turn your camera off and on as you wish. And also, we're really hoping that this talk with Shreena will be an opportunity for some dialogue as well. So we're hoping that you might be wanting to submit some questions. And there are a couple of ways that you can do that. So the first way here is to email your questions directly to Avery anytime during the talk. And that's Avery's email address there. And when Avery receives your question, she will ask on your behalf and keep your name anonymous. If you would like to submit your question to the chat box, you're welcome to do that. Just be aware that the chat box is public, so all participants can see it. So you can either directly submit your question to the chat box, or you can just put your name and Avery will call on you and you're welcome to ask your question directly that way. So I wanted to introduce our two moderators here on the call, Lorraine Diaz and Avery Lewis. They're my colleagues at Living Yoga, and they'll be helping us out with questions and just making sure this goes smoothly. So before I introduce Shreena, I just wanted to briefly talk about Living Yoga and the work that we do. So I know some of you are really familiar with Living Yoga. Some of you may be new to it. So Living Yoga is a nonprofit here based in Portland, Oregon, and we have been around for about 21 years. And for that time, we have been providing yoga and mind-body classes at various sites, including locked facilities, reentry and recovery facilities and centers, as well as community health centers. And prior to COVID, we were at 24 different sites. We were serving 600 students a month, and we were training, and we have trained over 200 volunteers who are the folks who go into these facilities and facilitate classes. Because of COVID, we're no longer able to be in all of our sites, but we are able to provide some online classes right now at, I believe, two of our sites right now, which work with folks who are in recovery, both adults and youth. And we'll be offering online courses in July at 2 of our other sites. We're also offering, we launched a 15-minute body-based practice. These are free and open to anyone. We hold them on Zoom. And these are just very short, simple, accessible practices. They're the same practices twice a week, so you have the opportunity to develop a consistency with your practice. And we're doing these for the next 8 weeks or so through the end of July. So you can look out for those on our website. We also have a body-based resiliency training. This is a 90-minute training that we developed, and it's really a mix of a presentation that talks about trauma and resiliency mixed in with several, again, very simple, accessible mind-body practices that you can, practice throughout your day. And these are, this body-based resiliency training is something that we've offered for organizations of all sizes. And we also have our social justice culture initiative, which is if you sign up for the initiative, it's free to sign up. And every month we send you topics related to social justice, and specifically we focus on racialized trauma. So we'll send you resources and discussion prompts, and we ask that you can use these prompts for self-study. You can form small racial affinity groups and discuss them in groups. It's really up to you. So those are monthly resources and prompts that we send. And you know, we're a small nonprofit, so any donations or any, you know, we do a lot of fundraising, but donations certainly help. And so if Avery or Lorene, if you could post the link at some point to that page, that would be wonderful. And if you have any questions about Living Yoga, feel free to email me. There's my email, mira@livingyoga.org. So, sorry, let me just go back. So now I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Shreena Gandhi. I've known Shreena for several years, and right now Shreena is part of the Religious Studies Department at Michigan State University, where she primarily teaches classes on religion and race in the Americas. She's currently finishing up edits on a manuscript, which is called A Cultural History of Yoga in the United States, which looks at the impacts of race, gender, and class on how yoga is practiced and commodified in religious and secular spaces. She's also working on 2 other projects, one on religious seeking in the colonial and post-colonial global South, which uses her grandfather's writings and books as primary evidence, as well as the writings of other colonial and post-colonial religious seekers. She's also working on a collaborative project on how to transform US religious history into an anti-racist, anti-colonial, and anti-sexist discipline, which helps move forward the goals of decolonization. Dr. Gandhi has presented her work nationally and internationally and is committed to intersectional scholarship and meticulous research grounded in facts. So Shreena, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone at Living Yoga, Mira and Lauren, who I started collaborating with a few months ago, and today Avery and Lorene for making this so seamless and so easy for me. So I've just got a few comments to make, and then I'd really like to have a discussion. I've seen some of your questions already, and they've given me some great kind of food for thought. And so I'll just start with my comments, and then we can hopefully have a discussion. I welcome questions and challenges and yeah, good thoughts. So I'll start with this. Some of you, if you Googled my name, you might have come across a blog post I wrote a few years ago for a social justice website. And when it was first posted, it was called Yoga and the Roots of Cultural Appropriation. When it was first posted, no one read it, right? And my co-author was despondent. She's a white woman who works here in Michigan on somatic practice and again, trauma-based yoga. And she was really disappointed. And I was like, it's, you know, a local social justice website. No one's going to read it, but we put it out there in the world. And so I was like, don't worry. And I think this was like in October of 2017, November 2017. Fast forward a few months, I get, it goes viral, right? In a really nasty, horrible, violent way. I get various types of threats, and I'm, you know, featured on a neo-Nazi website. I'm also getting hate mail from people who describe themselves as liberals and progressives. And this is why people kind of freaked out over this, right? The first sentence of the blog post is this, right? We wrote this, quote, "To the so many white people who practice yoga, please don't stop. but please do take a moment to look outside of yourself and understand how the history of yoga practice in the United States is intimately linked to some of the larger forces of white supremacy. And people went nuts over this sentence, saying that yoga is white supremacy, which is clearly not what the sentence says. People said stuff like, you know, India appropriates toilets, so give us back the toilets and we'll give you back yoga. You know, a lot of people telling me to go back to India, which I was actually born in London. My family's from East Africa. And when they left India, there was no India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. It was just all the British Empire. So it was very scary, but also very eye-opening for me as to why this blog post hit a nerve. And I think after the threats and everything calmed down, I realized that maybe I was onto something. Like, I hit a nerve because I hit a truth, right? And so I guess what I should say first is, and we didn't do this in the blog post. The blog post is 500 to 1,000 words. You can't do your whole dissertation in the blog post, right? And so the first thing I would say is, as I'm talking to you, is what is white supremacy, right? What do we mean by white supremacy? And I think when people hear that, they just immediately think the KKK, the alt-right, you know, I'm forgetting the guy who started the alt-right thing, but Richard Spencer, right? And how he holds up signs that say, I'm a racist, you know, come talk to a racist. And he was kind of one of the organizers behind what happened in Charlottesville. So that's what people think about. And that's really easy to latch onto, right? Because those are outward, visible, material instances of racism, right? Someone saying the N-word, they're like, okay, that's racist, right? But someone telling you that you speak well, right? That's also racist, but it's not seen as that, right? It's seen as something that's a good thing to say to someone, right? So what I mean by white supremacy is a larger system, a larger culture that is held up by 3 pillars. And those pillars are capitalism. And capitalism exists as a system because of enslavement, because of the enslavement of Black people forcibly taken from West Africa and brought to the Americas, right? And don't just mean the United States, I mean all over the Americas, from Canada to Chile and everything in between, right? And that free labor was able to provide the capitalism for the engine of capitalism to grow and to become ridiculously strong, right? And so capitalism is tied to enslavement, and that's also tied to then anti-Black racism. Right? The second pillar is colonialism, and specifically settler colonialism in the Americas, where in order for us as settlers to claim the land, we had to get rid of indigenous people. So colonialism involves genocide, and the genocide of so many Native people, again, from Canada to Chile and everything in between, and or what they would call Turtle Island. And so colonialism involves anti-indigenous racism, and this idea that you know, indigenous people have to disappear, right? They have to disappear, they have to assimilate. And then finally, the third pillar is war, this idea that we have to dominate certain areas, and we justify that domination through Orientalism, this idea that brown people, East Asian people are, they might be exotic, they might have cool functions of their features, but they're ultimately inferior and they're kind of stuck in the past. And so war and Orientalism also involves anti-brown or anti-yellow racism, right? So all of these kind of work together to uphold this myth of white supremacy, right? This idea that white people are superior just through genetics, through culture, etc., to other non-white people. And the very reasons that yoga spread around the world, specifically came here to the United States, are intimately connected to all 3 pillars in some way, whether it's capitalism, whether it's the colonization of India, or it's the kind of Orientalism or exotic kind of romantic notions of what India, South Asia, Hinduism is, right? So, sorry, I can't turn off the notifications for my um, messages. So I'm going to try to do that because I apologize for that. So, you know, when I first agreed to give this talk, we were kind of in the middle of COVID, right? And being in lockdown and just kind of dealing with isolation. And then, you know, I think in the moment of COVID, things about our society got exposed. Fault lines of our society were exposed. And I think for many people, for the first time, people were starting to see what our real values were, not the values that we put on for show, right? And there was definitely agitation and, you know, why don't we have healthcare for everyone? Why are these tests, you know, going to cost money, and why can't we get enough tests, and what's going on with our supply chain, right? People were asking those questions, right? And in the midst of this, we hear about the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, and a few weeks later, the tape comes out of his lynching, right? To be perfectly frank, and then we hear about the murder of Breonna Taylor, right? Whose killers are still walking free, and we find out more and more stuff every day about the warrant process, and you know, that her boyfriend is still charged for shooting a gun, and that she died in her sleep, right? And then of course, I think the cry of George Floyd calling for his mom and saying, "I can't breathe," is the cry heard around the world, right? And after that, you have ensuing protests, right? I feel like, I don't know about you guys, but I started following this Instagram account called Karen's Going Wild. And I feel like every day there's like 3 or 4 posts of women, mainly white women, sometimes white men, who are just freaking out over the smallest of things, and overreacting. Or there was one woman who was standing with a Confederate flag saying, you know, "I'm going to teach my grandchildren to hate you," right? When she was talking to the Black Lives Matters protesters. And so, you know, what I'm seeing right now is, if COVID exposed our fault lines, right now these protests are creating earthquakes, and showing that that we as Americans, right, we have a white supremacy culture and system problem, right? White supremacy is built on this very weak and easily demonstrable false myth that white people are superior to all other people. And as a result, I think parts of our culture, maybe all of our culture, we have to wait to see, it's kind of falling down, right? And what I'm seeing also is people, particularly white people, reacting in a multitude of ways, right? We have folks joining the movement, getting right out there on the streets with these protesters, putting their bodies in front of Black protesters, putting their hands up, really kind of being that front line in some ways, and also just being there in solidarity. And they're also taking the brunt of some of the police brutality, or at least trying to stop the police from going after Black protesters, and doing other things, right? Educating themselves, listening, kind of really looking inward into what does it mean to be white in America today. That's one thing I'm seeing, right? I'm also seeing people just kind of sticking their head in the sand, saying stuff like, well, there's good people on both sides. These protests are maybe too much. When are the protests going to stop? They're kind of inconveniencing me. And that really has nothing to do with me, right? I'm not racist. That's, you know, kind of, again, like an ostrich. And I think a lot of people feel very comfortable there and don't want to feel uncomfortable. And I think the process of becoming anti-racist, of examining yourself, is uncomfortable, and necessarily so, right? And then I think what I'm also seeing is people doubling down on their illusion of superiority, right? Again, like that woman saying, I'm going to teach my grandchildren to hate you or to hate your children. You're seeing the rhetoric of a white privilege is race, like the rhetoric of white privilege is racist. I think some political advisor said that today, and I just kind of scrolled past it on Twitter when someone was reacting to it because I didn't have the energy for that moment, right? And so you're seeing these three things happen. I think a lot of us who have been in critical race studies, who have been a part of the Black Lives or the movement for Black Lives since 2013, those of us who have talked about race in our classes and been told that it's not a good thing because it makes our students feel uncomfortable, for the first time, I'm feeling some shifts, right? But I'm also being cautiously optimistic, very cautious, because there have been other points where I started to feel some shifts and I got wildly disappointed, you know. So we'll see what happens. But I guess what I'm trying to get to is that when looking at yoga, we have to look at white supremacy culture, right? And also not only that, but also the very being and the process of whiteness, right? Because I think that this helps explain why yoga is the way it is today, right? When you look at the history of yoga, how it's translated, how it's been practiced, how it's been commodified, how it's been raced, gendered, and classed, it shows us how whiteness and cultural appropriation work, right? And what I argue in my book, and I'll just read straight from my book here, I say yoga has been culturally constructed in a particular way as Eastern, as mystical, as non-Hindu, universal and scientific, as a practice for better health, and thus easily appropriated. And the question that I think white folks have to ask themselves is why appropriation, right? And why does appropriation make us feel so uncomfortable and sometimes make us feel a little angry and a little indignant, right? And what I explain in my book, particularly through the figure of Henry David Thoreau, great kind of American romantic hero of civil disobedience, right, is that whiteness is a process that happens, right, generation after generation after generation. And what it involves is an exchange of culture for power. What happens in the process of having to lose culture, right, is a rootlessness, I think, that sometimes I have witnessed when reading Thoreau and reading people like Madame Blavatsky and the Omnipotent, all these kind of figures that make up the history of yoga in the United States, is they're looking for some sort of rootedness because they've experienced this somewhat traumatic, somewhat destabilizing process of becoming white, right? You get the power, but then what happens to the culture? Right? And this is why, sorry, I'm just gonna go back and just say one thing, that there are a few ways that we see this process of whiteness playing out in white America. I think one, there's a turn to white nationalism. And that's, again, I think the most easily identifiable, where you see, people joining the KKK or the alt-right or some sort of neo-Nazi, white power, white purity group. You see people flying the Confederate flag, saying this is my, my heritage, not hate. And they kind of just stick to that idea of nationalism, right? That if you're questioning their actions, that you're also then questioning the United States in some ways, although I still have a hard time with the logic of the Confederate flag. I'm just going to throw that out there as a historian. I struggle with that one. But so the second thing I think that you see among some groups that are ethnic, that become white, is an attempt to reclaim their ethnic pride, right? And you see that historically with Italian Americans, for example, kind of taking Columbus and like claiming him as their own, saying, the first American here was an Italian American, or the first European here was an Italian, and, and really kind of making Columbus Day like a thing, because it wasn't always a thing. And the other thing about Columbus is that when he traveled the Atlantic Ocean and landed on the island of Hispaniola, there was no Italy, right? Italy was a conglomeration of city-states that fought more than they had any sort of unity, at the time at least, right? You see the emergence of Italy as unified and as a nation state much later, about 300 years, almost 400 years after Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? But one way of kind of claiming Italian pride is through Columbus, also through food. You see that with the Irish as well, less so with the Irish with the food, although I'm a Brit, so I do love shepherd's pie and all that kind of stuff that most Americans don't like. But I think Irish food is very good, but although it's very different than British food, let me just say that out there, because I know there's a colonial history there too. So that's, I think, the second way that you see people dealing with this loss, this rootedlessness. And then the other thing that I see among white folks, particularly on the progressive left, is seeking rootedness in other cultures, right? And this is where the kind of turn to yoga, I think, sometimes comes in, martial arts. In academia, Mira knows this, we have this phenomena of academics going native, right? And just taking on the religion, the culture, the language, just everything of where they've done their field work, and kind of being colonizers in other ways. The thing about all of this is that I think part of the process of becoming anti-racist, and some of you already asked this question, so I've tried to put this in the talk a little bit, is examining this history, right? If you want to become anti-racist and you want to start down that path, looking at the history is first, whether it's the history of the United States and enslavement, or it's the history of land seizure, right? If you, like, I go to I don't go to MSU, I teach at MSU, so I always tell my students, you're a land grant university. That meant that land was forcibly taken away and treaties were broken of the local Chippewa tribe, right? And that's why you have this big university right here in the middle of Michigan. So I think examining the history of yoga is also a part of becoming anti-racist, right? And examining whiteness and how the two are tied together. So I just want to go quickly back to the blog post, right? And how people, in my opinion, just overreacted, right? On the right and the left, because I just suggested that people just think about cultural appropriation, not stop doing yoga, but just think about, the fact that it comes from South Asia, that if you look at the sculptures that are dotted all over South Asia, you'll see women in like 900 CE, sculptures of women doing yoga, right? So this is a history that is kind of deep, embedded in multiple material ways, right? And, but I think the very insinuation that a woman of color was maybe telling them no, right? Even though I wasn't telling them no, made some of them go really violent, really, for lack of a better word, mean, right? I'm not gonna hide and say I didn't cry multiple times reading some of those emails, but I think here's the thing with capitalism, right? One of the pillars of white supremacy. Capitalism rarely tells us no. If we have the resources, we can buy anything, right? If you want a doodad, I've got a doodad. If you want a doodad like this, you can, especially now, you can go on the internet and go onto Etsy and probably find this very doodad on some, Etsy site that's selling straight out of India, right? This my dad brought me from India the last time he went, so that's why I have this doodad. You know, if you want a frame or like a particular bottle that says your hospital name on it, you can get that. You know, I always tell my students that have stickers on their laptops, and some of these stickers are really unusual, and I'm like, where did you find that? And they're like, oh yeah, I Googled it and I was able to buy it. So we live in this culture where if we want to buy something, we can, right? If we want to own something, we can. And that's pretty spectacular. But when you start thinking about why that is, it's because we still have, you know, underpaid, enslaved labor that are doing things for us to make our lives easier, right? I always use the example of the phone because, you know, this is one of the things that I personally ethically struggle with. Is I know that right now in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there are mines that are mining certain elements that go into this iPhone, and they're being underpaid. They're being women are being raped, men are being mutilated, just so I can have this convenience of getting text right away and knowing exactly like where my brother is at this particular moment, or exactly where my mom is, right? And so I think that's one of the things about capitalism that we don't think about, right? Capitalism enables us to forget about the labor, and it allows us to consume anything. And I think whenever someone says, no, you can't consume that, right? Or that there are limits to your consumption, it jars us and makes us, I think, go a little, as I said before, a little violent. And I especially think about, I'm working with a local indigenous man on a larger cultural appropriation project. And he's really invested in getting mascots to no longer be Indian folks, right? He's like, you know, whether it's the Cleveland Indians or the Atlanta Braves or the, you know, the Washington team, which is a racial slur. He's like, I don't understand why they just won't change the name. And we had the conversation the other day, and I said, people just don't like to be told no, because nothing in our culture tells us no, right? Everything is about our pleasure, our comfort, you know, and so, you know, you have a lot of Native Americans saying, please stop using the word redskin. And there's just total pushback, total denial. And yeah, it's you know, it's again, it's connected to white supremacy, because capitalism is connected to white supremacy, right? So I think what I would say is, I'm going to reiterate this again, we have capitalism because of Black enslaved labor, whether it was, you know, 500, 600 years ago, 200 years ago, or in some ways now, in the here and now. And I think whiteness, as it's been constructed, involves the myth of no limits, right? And white supremacy ensures that no limit kind of vibe, that culture, on the backs of people of color. So when we look at structural racism, in my opinion, we have to look at everything that white supremacy touches, right? From the police and the military to the very ways in which we consume, right? And I just want to say, as an aside, like right now the focus should be on what Black people are going through, right? What they're experiencing every day, the trauma they experience. And so the focus, in my opinion, you know, like, I'm really honored to be here, but what I study and what I do shouldn't be the focus in this moment. The focus really needs to be what Black people are going through, and in my community, in particular the South Asian community, what are the ways in which we uphold an anti-Black narrative, right? And how can we fight against that and dismantle that, right? But here's the thing, people have accused me of saying, you know, you shouldn't do yoga because of cultural appropriation, but I will never tell anyone not to practice yoga. And I think I'm speaking to a majority of yoga practitioners. And the reason I say that is because I think that yoga can help with all of this, right? In terms of structural racism and the dismantling of white supremacy, the dismantling of oppression in general, whether it's, also patriarchy, and all the other kinds of oppressions that I'm not thinking of right now. Because here's the thing about yoga is that I think the practice, if done in a correct, correct is not the right word, but in a mindful way in regards to social justice, in regards to oppression, etc., that the practice of yoga can help decenter oneself, whether it's your privilege of whiteness, or in my case, I have several different privileges, whether it's economic, whether it's job security, etc., right? Like, I think it's very easy for a non-Black person of color to be like, I experience racism too, but it's much harder to acknowledge one's privileges. And I think the ways in which yoga makes you focus on your body allows you to see those privileges, right? No matter who you are. Because I think in many ways, when you're an American, you experience privilege in really different ways, no matter what kind of American you are, right? And and I think the path of anti-racism, right, means decentering ourselves, right? I've been teaching about race, about white supremacy for about 15 years now. And I tell my students several things, right? One is that you can't just say that you're not a racist, that all of us have little prejudice bellies, little monsters, prejudice monsters, running around in our bellies, just wanting to come out, because we've all been racialized in some way, right? If you're white, you've been racialized in a particular way. If you're brown, you've been racialized in a particular way, right? And the way in which you move through society, as much as race is constructed, has material impacts, right? Depending on how you've been racialized. So we all carry racism in some way, or prejudice or discrimination in some way in us, right? And we have to be able to control that little monster in our bellies, and we have to be able to make it smaller. But I think the first thing is to acknowledge it, right? Acknowledge that we hold some racist ideas, we hold discriminatory ideas, we hold sexist ideas, right? I mean, I'm raising a 15-year-old, and it's a daily struggle to get him to realize that men and women are equal, right? And that there are multiple genders, and that, there is not one superior gender, right? It's very difficult and very frustrating. And so any of you else that have 15-year-olds that are struggling with this, like, if you have any tips or tricks, I'll take them, right? So that's the one thing I tell them is, first you have to acknowledge that we're prejudiced, we're prejudicial beings, right? But that doesn't mean that that can control you, or that this should define who you are. Everyone's going to make mistakes. I think that's the other thing you have to acknowledge. You're going to make mistakes, but you have to focus not on your feelings or your intentions, but look at your actions and your impacts, right? So if someone tells you that was racist, the reaction shouldn't be, well, my intention wasn't. The reaction should be, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that my impact was that way. I will change my action so my impact is different next time, right? And I say this to my students, as well as the children I'm raising all the time. Actions always speak louder than words, right? And words can be manipulated in ways that actions necessarily can't be. And I think when we're talking about anti-racism, or we're talking about dismantling white supremacy, that's one of the things that I say is, let your actions speak, and don't worry about the words per se. And just like in yoga, right? It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay that you can't touch your toes. I still can't touch my toes after so many years. But I think the other thing is that yoga helps us listen to our bodies and listen to others. And that is such an important part of this moment right now, is the listening to the experiences of, in particular right now, Black folks who have been struggling, right? And just feeling the brunt of white supremacy culture for 500 years, right? So I guess what I'll end with is this, is that yoga tunes us into our bodies, and perhaps we can also use it to look outwards beyond ourselves and towards the hope of a more just future. So I will end there. I hope I didn't take up too much time, Mira. But I'm open to questions, or I can start looking at, I've got the questions right here in front of me from what people have already asked, if you want me to start with that.
Hi, Shreena. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And I think it's really important for us as folks in various ways in the yoga community to really understand how we can use our practice in ways that enact anti-racism. And I think that the connection that you made between yoga being a way in which we can displace our self or decenter ourselves is really important. So thank you for that. There were several questions that that I received before this talk, specifically asking about the cultural appropriation in yoga, and specifically about the use of the word namaste. So I know you've seen some of these questions, so I was wondering if you could address that in the sense of, like, is it appropriate to you? Well, even before answering the question, is it appropriate? I was wondering, Shreena, if you had thoughts on how this practice became associated with yoga, and then maybe if you can talk about questions around appropriateness in using it in the context of yoga.
So, I think, so not to break anyone's bubble, but namaste just means hey. Right? It just means hey. I think in particular in Hindi, Mira, you would know more about this than me. In Gujarati, which is the native language, Indian language that I speak, and it's a kind of because we're East African, it's got Swahili words in it too. So when I go to Gujarat, sometimes people are just like, what word did you just use, right? Because language moves and is hybrid and is constantly changing. But in Gujarat, you never hear namaste. I didn't even realize what namaste was until much later in life. And I started seeing people use it in terms of yoga. People are now, like, I notice people are saying, like, oh, it means like the light in you sees the light in me, something like that. But really, it's like, hey, what's up? And my colleague Rumia Puncha, and I can send you her blog post and everything, has written a lot about this, and has been interviewed, and so I defer to her authority on it. I'm not the biggest fan of it. I think just ending with a simple "have a great day" is just as appropriate. The other thing about yoga that is complicated, that I'm to be honest, I'm struggling with, is if we have problems with white supremacy in the Americas, right? The South Asia, right, from pretty much everywhere, Hindu and some non-Hindus as well, have a caste supremacy problem, right? And part of that caste supremacy is very much tied to the language of Sanskrit, which has been the language of that upper caste, highest caste of the priests, of the Brahmins. And so I think the roots of namaste are from that particular language. And I think someone also asked about, I don't know if someone asked or not, but maybe I was just thinking about this, like, should you refer to certain yoga poses and their Sanskrit names? And, on the one hand, I think one of the reasons people like namaste and like Sanskrit is that it gives them access to this, to a kind of romantic, exotic experience of yoga, right? And you've got the the sitar music in the background, and maybe you have some incense and you have the dimmed lights, and so it gives you this whole kind of orientalist experience. But at the same time, when we use Sanskrit, or we're not really looking at the complexity of necessarily of India and the oppression of Sanskrit and the history of the oppression that is connected to Sanskrit and to Brahmanical patriarchy, to be perfectly honest. And so what I would say is, again, just look at the ways in which your practice of yoga maybe reinforces some of these orientalist feelings, but at the same time, if when you're ready, you want to go a step beyond, how sometimes our practice of yoga can reinforce certain casteist ideas of India. And I think that's really important because India is going through, for lack of better terms, a particularly fascist moment, right? And that fascist moment, in my opinion, also means the demonization of Muslims, as well as Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi caste people. Does that kind of answer the question? And then I think there was another question regarding other practices that yoga students should be careful with or avoid. I think I kind of said that with the Sanskrit. A lot of like Iyengar, Pratibha Joyce. I'm trying to think of other yoga teachers. There's one in my head whose the name is sort of escaping me right now. But even today, like Ramdev, they use Indian languages, and particularly the Sanskrit language, to kind of give yoga this kind of sense of authority, and this sense of history, which it has a very deep history already, right? To kind of give it a legitimacy as well. And so I guess what I would say is, let's look at the ways in which Sanskrit was utilized as a tool, while ignoring, again, this like longer history of caste supremacy in South Asia. And in terms of other practices yoga students should be careful with or avoid, I can't think of any others off the top of my head beyond the Sanskritization and yeah. But I definitely, like, someone asked, should we even be calling what we teach as white people in the West yoga? And yeah, I think that's okay to say this is yoga, right? And I think the most important part is to say this is a practice that came from South Asia, right? There's a book coming out this year that basically argues that yoga is a white woman's invention. And I have pictures from Khajuraho, which are these beautiful carved temples in central India, that show otherwise, right? And so I guess erasing South Asia, or erasing South Asian women in particular from the history of yoga is the harm, So I think it's really simple for a yoga teacher to be like, this comes from South Asia, and you guys, have you heard of that book, Eat, Pray, Love? Maybe some of you. And I criticize that book because, she goes to Italy to eat, and then she goes to India to pray, and she talks about this great Italian food and everything. But, Italy also is the place where she went to Rome. The Vatican City is right there, right? I wouldn't say to any Catholic that there's nothing spiritual about the Catholic Church, right? And here's the thing about India is that it has fucking fabulous food. I mean, we all think of it as like Punjabi butter chicken tikka masala, but there's a great program on Netflix that kind of goes into the regionality of Indian food, if you guys are interested. And it's so diverse and it's so delicious. And so I'm like, why did you go to India just to pray? Why didn't you go to India to eat food, right? And I think that's the thing that I try to remind people all the time of, is that India is just as complex as Italy. And people aren't just doing yoga and praying in India all the time. You go to India and I think people imagine, like, people just, like Thoreau, right? Thoreau imagined himself being a yogi on the banks of the Ganges River when he was sitting at Walden Pond, right? And that's not all what people do in India, right? They just don't pray and not eat. They eat a ton. Indians love their food. South Asians love their food, no matter where in South Asia. I went to Sri Lanka and people couldn't stop feeding me. So, and I feel like that's just a part of the culture. If you go to someone's house, you can't not eat something. You must. Even if it tastes horrible, you have to eat something. So I think just remembering that this practice comes from South Asia, and South Asia is really complex, you know. So
Rena, thank you. I've received a couple of questions in my chat box that I can just ask you in the order in which they came.
okay.
So this is the question. I realize that this may be diverging from the topic of this conversation, although I don't think it is. But I would love to hear Dr. Gandhi speak to the controversy of yoga being used as a symbol of Hindu nationalism in the Modi administration.
Oh, it's not diverting at all. And in fact, there was another question that asked about International Day of Yoga, and if I can speak about it. And that very much connects to Modi, because one of the things that Modi has tried to do, and the Indian government has tried to do prior to Modi, is not only catalog yoga, but make it so that yoga is an import from India, right? And that it's very much tied to Indian nationalism. It's tied to, just like you have like football here tied to American nationalism, yoga being tied in like a kind of strongman kind of way to Hindu nationalism. And this idea that yoga is just Hindu. And I would say, as a scholar, I would say about probably 80% of the history of yoga prior to colonialism is Hindu, right? But there were also Jains and Muslims and Sikhs and Buddhists that also practiced yoga, had their own forms of body movement, of connecting mind and body, that we also have to kind of acknowledge, and kind of shows how complex, right? There's not a single origin to yoga per se, other than somewhere in South Asia, is what I tell people all the time. And so I think yoga is being utilized as a tool of nationalism by Modi and people like Baba Ramdev, who have become, Baba Ramdev, if you guys are not familiar with him, but he's become kind of the yoga teacher of the Hindu/Indian diaspora, right? You can see him on satellite TV, and we don't have satellite Indian TV, but if a lot of Indian homes do, and he's on there every morning, right, doing his breathing exercises. And then he also sells like a litany of products, of Ayurveda products, that you can buy in India or you can buy here in the United States. And he is very controversial because he'll say, for lack of a better word, stupid stuff, criminal stuff about how yoga can cure AIDS and cure cancer and help you with heart attacks. And yes, yoga does help you with your circulatory health and slowing down your breathing, slowing down your heart rate, all that kind of stuff. But it does not cure cancer or AIDS. If you're prone to have a heart attack, you're prone to have a heart attack. All right. It can help. Right. There was one guy, Swami Kuvalayananda, who did these like experiments in the early 1900s where he like hooked himself up to like heart monitors to show how yoga can like slow down heart rate, slow down breathing rate. But beyond that, it's not going to cure AIDS. And that's really, really criminal advice to give in a country that has problems with AIDS and people dying of AIDS, right? So, yeah, I guess that's how I would answer my question, right? He is using yoga as a tool. And this is something that I feel like people who are Indian, who are South Asian in the diaspora, Desi in the diaspora, this is their moment to be like, what he's doing is wrong. What he's doing to Muslims is wrong. How he's weaponizing yoga is wrong. What he's doing to Dalit folks is wrong. What he's doing in Kashmir, right? This is like, a lot of South Asian folks are like, we'll be anti-Trump here, but we'll like be pro-Modi, right? And I have to say, right, if you're against fascism here, you're against fascism there, right? There's no like you know, and the conversation that I feel like I have to have with my community is about stuff like this, and not just about white supremacy and how South Asians are often pitted against Black Americans in terms of the myth of model minority and the kind of promise of the proximity to whiteness. But also what I have to say to them is we also have to fight caste supremacy in our communities here in the United States, but also globally. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I wanted to pick up on something that you just mentioned regarding the prospect or promise of yoga as a powerful healing medium or practice. So there was a couple of questions about healing. So
Hello?
yeah, can you hear me? Shrina, you there?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah,
Okay, good.
I'm
So
here.
we have a question. Yoga is a powerful physical, emotional, and spiritual healer when practiced with the right intentions in the right context. Can you talk about what appropriation means in the context of healing? And I would like to add, can you also talk about understanding how and when adopting yoga practices as a healing tool would be considered inappropriate?
Right. And again, this is why I responsibly and ethically would never tell anyone to not practice yoga, because it does help, right? It does, those of us who have done it, and I'm like not the best at practicing every day, right? But you know, it makes your body feel better. You know, you feel healthier, more energetic, your breathing becomes better, you're more flexible, right? You're one of the reasons I'm able to, you can't really see me, but I'm sitting cross-legged on the floor. One of the reasons I'm able to do that for hours is yoga and meditation, right? I've trained my body in a particular way. And you know, I'm 41 and I still don't feel like some of the aches and pains of other folks. And I know that has a lot to do with practicing yoga since I was a little girl, right? Even when I was like 6 or 7, I didn't want to do it. My grandparents would be like, you know, sit there and do this stretch and do that, you know, and I, now looking back, I thank them for it. So it definitely is, it works, right? I think that's why it's also so popular. And people should definitely not stop doing it. In terms of this question about healing, you know, I think as a medical practitioner, as a healing practitioner, definitely suggest it to your patients. And I don't know that it's necessarily considered inappropriate. I think when the inappropriate comes in when it's, you know, uh, not made reference to its origins, right? When people will like try to patent it and say, you know, I invented this, or will make inordinate amounts of money without thinking about, you know, how certain populations in South Asia are still suffering, whether it's Muslims or Dalits or, you know, people in poverty, right? I'm always very mindful of, we have not only a caste supremacy problem in India, but we have a patriarchy problem in India. So I think those are the things that I would say, but I wouldn't say not to not have your patients do it, right? As a healer, you want your patients to have every tool possible so that they can heal and live a full life, right? And so to take that away and say that's cultural appropriation, I feel is not a nice thing, for lack of a better word, right? I wouldn't want to take that away from anyone. But again, I think kind of contextualizing it with your patients, being like, this is a practice from South Asia, and you know, you could read more about it here, and you know, I hope it helps you. There's actually a great episode. I don't know if you guys ever watched King of the Hill, right? Some of you might be a little bit younger, but this was like a cartoon that I loved it, even though it was about this like white family from Texas. And there's one episode where Hank hurts his back and does yoga, and you know, his back then feels better. I think that's such a great episode to kind of illustrate how yoga gets kind of orientalized, but how it's also really useful for even someone like Hank who prefers to stand in the alley and drink beer and be American. Right.
Um, so, you mentioned that it's important for folks who are yoga practitioners to sort of reference the context and the cultural origins of yoga, and to be knowledgeable about that. And at the same time, there's a couple of questions here about the use of Sanskrit in your practice, whether it's using the names of the different asanas, or whether it's like, again, invoking the kind of namaste in a way that it's not used in an everyday South Asian context. So how would you respond to when folks are asking about whether they should use Sanskrit words in their everyday yoga practices as a teacher? Because someone mentioned that they would use Sanskrit depending on the context, but when someone is teaching, for example, in a locked facility, or for folks who are going through rehabilitation, that they'll avoid using Sanskrit words in order just to keep the practice really simple and accessible.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I would just say sometimes Sanskrit makes yoga inaccessible, right? And if we're thinking about yoga as a tool for social justice, one of them is accessibility, right? You guys focus on trauma-informed yoga, which is wonderful. And one of the things about trauma-informed yoga is that you don't touch your students, right? And so that makes it accessible to people who've experienced certain types of trauma, because they're not worried about that feeling, right, of being touched. And especially for like PTSD and stuff like that, I think that's incredibly important. And for people who just in general, I think Sanskrit makes yoga seem something that it's really not, and more kind of elevated, Brahmanical, exotic, and really it's just the process of using your body to not only to kind of figure out the limits of how it can move, right? But also to look inside yourself and how you are connected to certain sensations in your body, right? And so I think Sanskrit maybe makes it feel a little bit inaccessible, but also I think the use of Sanskrit in yoga kind of takes away the regional histories of yoga, how people in India use regional languages to kind of describe various asanas and breathing exercises or pranayams. Does that kind of answer the question? Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a tricky one because, at one time we want to recognize and acknowledge the lineage and the ancestry and the history of yoga, and at the same time we also want to be careful that in assuming that Sanskrit is the only language in which yoga is practiced is problematic, and that feeds into what you were talking about earlier about Orientalism and the way in which what Orientalism and as the third pillar of white supremacy, what it ultimately does is it flattens differences and diversity.
And here's the thing about Sanskrit: no one speaks it. It's like Latin, right? And the Catholic Church let go of Latin a long time ago, 1965, right? So not that long ago, but longish, right? And so the majority of South Asians do not know Sanskrit. They can maybe recite a few shlokas or mantras in Sanskrit, the same way the majority of Muslims don't know Arabic, or the majority of Christians don't know Latin or Hebrew or Aramaic. Right? And I actually said to one of my students, I don't know students about the Bible, is that the Bible is written in several languages, and they had no idea, right? Because it's been translated for them, and most Christians don't know Aramaic, and that's okay, right? And the thing about India is that I think there are, correct me if I'm wrong, Mira, 16 languages and multiple regional dialects that, like if I'm, as I said, I'm Gujarati, I speak a certain type of East African Gujarati that uses multiple Swahili words. So when I go to Gujarat, people are like, what are you saying? And if I hear someone from an area of Gujarat called the Kutch, right, which is a huge desert region, and I hear them speak, I feel lost. I feel like, what language are you speaking? But there are a few words here and there that I can like discern, but it's very difficult, you know, just like in Spanish, there are regional Spanish, you know, people from Mexico might not understand people from, you know, Puerto Rico or Spain, or, you know, don't have the same exact, you know, language. So I think what Mira said about Orientalism flattening is really important. And so you can still talk about yoga being from South Asia without necessarily using Sanskrit.
Great. Did you have
Yeah, we have a couple questions. One of them related is, what about using Om or Oming in classes?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because the thing with Om is that you know, maybe I'm a little biased here, but if anyone's ever done an Om in class, right, and you feel it from Om from here through your entire body, right? And so someone in ancient South Asia, right, ancient India, figured out that that was a cool word to say, right? That you could, and you guys know it. You say the word Om and you say Om, you know, and you feel the vibrations. And someone on the Soma, right, or the bong juice or something, was like, this is pretty cool. And it is kind of cool, right? So I think saying that word, you know, and again, everything is contextual. Cultural appropriation is completely contextual, right? And so saying the word Om, I think, is really important to kind of realize how different parts of your body are connected, and you can feel that through the vibration of that word, right? So I think that's kind of vital and kind of cool. And folks back then figured out something about that word, about those two letters being together, that that I think are a part of the practice, right? And I can't think of an equivalent in English.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The other question I have has a little bit of background. This is someone named Zara, who's joining us from Australia. So that's really cool. Hi, Zara. Thank you. Just saw you come on. She says, thank you so much for hosting this talk. Everything that you've said has resonated with me on a deeply personal level, as I'm sure it would with most Southeast Asian women of color. I find myself being exhausted by Anglos and their policing of yoga, especially in terms of microaggressions, which prove to be just aggressions as their daily occurrences. For example, an older Karen in class was attracting attention for her yoga as fuck t-shirt. Obviously, she didn't appreciate me calling her out, and the hostility from the room made me avoid and eventually withdraw from the class. How do you center yourself from these experiences, and what do you suppose I can do to not be triggered by words or ignorant actions? Also, if you can please recommend some POC yoga teachers to follow, that would be great.
Yoga as fuck. I don't even know what that means. But I think what you're seeing more and more are yoga classes run by people of color, run by I think especially Black women are doing some really amazing things right now with using yoga for healing of racial trauma. I'm blanking on the name right now, but I can send it to Mira to send out to the group. I wrote just a kind of short article for a publication called The Revealer, where I talked about goat yoga and rage yoga and trauma-informed yoga. And in that trauma-informed yoga, I wrote about a woman in the Detroit area who is writing about yoga to help racial healing. So yeah, I think that there are some really amazing Black women doing things with body positivity and yoga that are really empowering. I think I don't have a good answer to what to do in the yoga class to not be triggered, because you know, I think the thing that is really difficult to understand about whiteness and white supremacy is that sometimes just being around white folks can feel violent and can feel triggering. And that's something that I think is really difficult for me to say in front of a majority white group. And I think it's something that's really difficult for my white friends who we've been having these conversations to kind of really understand. So that's the first thing I would say, Zara, is that it's all triggering, right? And I think right now, especially as non-Black people of color, everything feels very heavy right now, and what we do, how we move in the world, feels just kind of uncertain, right? And I feel a bit stretched thin, just kind of taking in everything. So I think the first thing I would say, in Australia, I don't know where in Australia, are you in Sydney? Yeah. I'm sure there are studios that are run by women of color. There are increasingly more students, or just people of color in general, but I'm biased for women, what can I say? And so I think that's one thing to do. The other thing to do is maybe you can email me or just find me on Instagram or Twitter privately, and I can tell you some people that you could follow, and they have, and anyone can, ask me questions afterwards. That's totally cool. But I can maybe send you some links to people who you could follow to do that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think one of the reasons that you do see more conservative Hindus writing about this is they've gone to yoga classes and have been told things like, I know I was told, how come you're not so good at yoga? Or how come you don't know this Sanskrit thing? And I was like, I never was taught Sanskrit growing up, right? Taught 2 languages, Gujarati and English, and then I took German in high school for some reason. Don't ask why I took German, but I did. It was fun. But yeah, I think, does that answer your question, Zara? Yeah.
Shreena, I have a couple of questions here, and just for those folks who have sent me questions, I'm going to try to get to all your questions if we have time. And if I don't get to your questions, I will make sure to copy them and then send them to Shreena, and maybe we can continue the conversation via email or some other way. But I wanted to ask you 2 questions. One is, one that came through is, this might be a heavy lift for you, Shreena, but can you kind of talk us through what might the differences between yoga practiced in India versus yoga practiced in the United States look like? Like, how do they look different? So that's the first question. So how do they look different between the 2 countries? And then the second question is, how would you suggest that we integrate the liberating teachings of yoga's philosophy to our students in America who might be wary of practicing a different religion or just want the physical benefits of it?
Okay. Yeah. So the first question is, increasingly you're seeing more Western, European, American style yoga studios in India, right? Where people have yoga mats and will wear yoga pants and a yoga t-shirt or wherever. But, you go to an ashram where they have yoga classes, you'll see women in saris doing yoga and doing it much better than I was, right? The other main difference that I find in Indian yoga classes versus US yoga classes are 2. One is, I would say Indian yoga classes focus a lot more on the breathing practices, on the pranayamas, right? I would say in an American yoga class, maybe like 10% of the class is devoted to that. I'd say in an Indian one, it's like more like 30%, right? And doing the ohms, doing the kind of breathe in and breathe out really quickly, doing, the different breathing out of one, it's just, it's a lot, and they really focus on that. The other thing is that every yoga pose you do in India, the teacher, she'll say, this will help with digestion. So every pose you do like helps with digestion. You could be doing like just, stretching one leg out that way, and it's like, well, this pose will help with digestion, and then every once in a while they'll throw in and this pose will help with like insulin production. production and pancreas, so it's like this will help with insulin's production and this and that, but the big one is the digestion. I feel like every pose, I couldn't stop laughing when like I was reflecting back on it, and I can't imagine a US yoga teacher or studio talking about digestion and how it's okay to fart doing a pose. Because here's the thing, you guys know that it happens, right? When you're practicing, but in India, they're very open and blunt about it in ways that we kind of tend to hide that kind of stuff. So that's one, right? In terms of the liberative, like, I think it's okay. Some people, if they want to just do yoga for the exercise and for the physical postures, that's fine, right? There are going to be yoga classes like that. Like, that's the thing about a capitalist system that I kind of came to the conclusion of, is that people have choices and people are going to make their choices, right? And just like you can't, be a social justice warrior, or whatever they call folks nowadays about everything, right? Those will be on burnout. You can't always choose, to be in a yoga class that focuses on, social justice and not cultural appropriation. Sometimes you just want to go to a yoga class and do some stretching and block out the world. And that is understandable, again, given what's going on right now. So if people want to just focus on the exercise part and the body part, I can understand that. And the other reason I understand that is because that's how yoga was sold, right? Swami Vivekananda, who was the first kind of Indian person to bring yoga to the United States, basically told his followers, like, you can go to church on Sunday and do your practice the rest of the days of the week, right? Yoga is complementary to Christianity, is what he would say, right? So I can see how people might not necessarily want the spiritual part of yoga, and I think that's okay. I think you can still say, though, that this is a practice from South Asia, right? And it's been practiced for thousands of years in various forms, and it's changed over time. And so, has it become secularized in the United States? Yes. Are there Christians that think that even doing the poses is, kind of bad and will lead you to demon worshiping? Yes, right? There's one person in particular, Lorette Willis, who has her own form of, she calls it a Christian alternative to yoga. And you look at all the poses and they look just like yoga, but she's like, these poses don't have the demon, worship part of it, so it's safe for Christians to do. And she's part of the movement to get her program, it's called Praise Moves, get praise moves into public schools and get yoga out of public schools. The fact of the matter is that yoga has become secularized, right? But I think, again, just being mindful of the fact that for some people it's not a secular practice. For some people it is a religious practice or part of their religious practice. And just like prayer can be used in multiple ways, I think yoga can be as well. I don't necessarily think it's my job to tell people how to practice or how not to practice, but maybe to point out the ways in which white supremacy culture allowed for yoga to flourish here.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I have, so two more questions. I just want to be mindful of time. We're coming up to the end of our time together. We're meant to part ways at 7:30, so we have about 8 minutes. So two questions. One is, what would be the recommended response of a white instructor who might lead a class? How might they handle microaggressions by students towards other students? Mm-hmm. In that, so that the white instructor can create a space that is safe for all. So that's the first question. How do you, as a white teacher, manage and handle microaggressions that happen in the classroom? And the second question is, what about organizing other practices or other types of traditions that come from South Asia in the United States? So the specific question was about organizing like a kirtan, which is a a practice that the Sikh community does, and it's a devotional singing kind of practice. So like, how would you respond to folks who want to bring that type of practice over to the US?
Okay, so the first question is, I think one of the things that I learned when I did anti-racism trainings, you know, I've been doing them for a couple of years. I like I've never actually run one, but I like participating in them, you know, because I'm a historian and I like looking at these kind of things. I think one of the things that I learned about how to talk about race is caucusing, right? And there is something that white folks can do that other non-white folks can't, and that is talk to white people, right? So if you see in your class as a teacher, you know, a white person doing microaggressions, intentionally or not, right, consciously or not, towards a person of color, what I would do in that moment is continue the class, right? Now, this is my own personal approach. Some people might want to stop the class, and then one, reach out to both parties, right? Reach out to the white person and say, what you did, you might not have realized, but your actions, you know, your impact was racist, right? And these are the ways in which you can kind of change that. And I'm happy to talk to you individually or in a group of white people about microaggressions and whiteness and how do we operate as white people in the world, right? I think that's one of the most powerful things that I got out of anti-racism trainings, is that ability to be like, you know what, not everyone needs to be involved in every discussion, right? And sometimes there are discussions that are just for Black folks, just for brown folks, just for folks of color. And sometimes there are discussions that are just for white folks, right? And that there's power in a white person talking to another person about this kind of stuff, right? And that's how you leverage your privilege. The other thing I would reach out to the person of color and say, you know, how are you doing? Are you okay? Just so you know, I mentioned this to the person. I don't know if they're necessarily going to stop or, you know, whatever, like just convey the conversation and ask how they're doing, right? I think one of the things that I've always found helpful, you know, and make me feel better is when people reach out to me about what I've experienced and saying that I see you, I recognize you, and you're not imagining it. I think sometimes, the thing with racism is that it changes so much that sometimes you know you've experienced something racist, but it's not that outward racist, you know, rhetoric or violence. And sometimes people don't believe you. And I think the most powerful thing you can do is say, I believe you, I saw what happened, I'm sorry, you know, and this is how I've addressed the situation. So I think that's how I would personally do it. I know that other people would like to stop in the middle of the class and call it out, and you know, everyone has their own style. I'm not super confrontational in general, you know. So that's one. The other, did that answer the first question? Yeah. Yeah. And then the second question, can you just remind me again about?
The second question is just about, you know, how would you respond to folks organizing events that are like that are specific to other religious traditions within South Asia and having them here in the United States? Is it appropriation?
Yeah, I think the Sikh community is one of the most socially just, active communities in the United States, and they would just welcome you to the kirtan. You know, I don't think you would need to necessarily organize your own. And so again, if you want to experience something like that, look to the community, you know, and they'll welcome you with open arms. Do you want to go to a Hindu puja? The temple priest will talk your ears off, and you'll be like, please, no more, right? You want to go to the mosque, right? I think they'll welcome you with Sikh temples and Hindu temples. You can sometimes even get a free meal, right? Sikhs have a very like intentional ethic about feeding people. You know, I think when I think about that, I think more about things like Ayurveda, right? And again, it's something that works, right? I still struggle with psoriasis, and one of the things that I use to help control my psoriasis is turmeric, what we call herther, because it, you know, like if I put herther like I make a paste of chickpea flour, milk, and turmeric, and I put that on my face, and it helps calm the inflation and stops the itch. The only thing I would say is don't try that at home without trying a little patch. Me and my white friend did it, and I turned a lovely golden color, and she turned yellow. So be careful. Right? But I think there are definitely things in Ayurveda that work. You see more and more Ayurvedic stores coming here, often run by South Asians. And again, if something works for you, especially when it comes to your health, right? My friend's son suffers from Crohn's disease, and he takes turmeric pills. That helps him, right? And how can anyone deny a child something that works and that helps, right? I just think, again, being mindful of the fact that it's from South Asia, and maybe if you're really interested in it, like, and you decide to start a business in it, like, give back some of that money, right, to communities that need it. And I think that's one of the things with capitalism, to kind of circle back to where we started, is that capitalism is about accumulation. And one of the ways that you can kind of be an intervention in that narrative is maybe we just have enough to live comfortably, right? Do we need to accumulate, or can we give back some of that money, and invest it locally where it could be actually used, instead of giving it to like Bill Gates.
Thanks. Yeah, and on that note, and I think it's an important note to think about, especially as we're having this discussion on cultural appropriation. Like, when you said, Shreena, that cultural appropriation is like the exchange of culture for power. One way to disrupt that is to then relinquish power, whether it's in the form of money or profit or things like that, and redistribute or reinvest into communities that are not, that have been historically divested from. So I think that's a really important point.
And I think I'm just going to end on this note. That's one of the hardest things to do, right? We're having the same discussion in academia. We're having this discussion around the country about how do we become more anti-racist? How do we dismantle white supremacy? And I think the thing that's going to be the hardest for those in power, so in this country be white folks, to do is to say, I'm going to let go of some of this power. I'm going to let go of some of this cultural capital. And this is a generational thing. This is not going to happen overnight, right? Maybe your grandkids will be still fighting this and dismantling, right? You can't break down in 50 what you built in 500, right? But I think the key is, how do we structure our society so that giving up power is actually easier and supported by culture, the structures, and in our case, the state, right? So.
Shreena, thank you so much for this really enlightening talk. And we managed to get quite a few questions answered. And I think there's still some questions that have yet to be answered, and I'll forward them to you.
Yes, please do.
And thank you everyone who is online right now for listening and for taking this in and for answering and for asking questions. It's a really important conversation that I hope that we can continue. And just to wrap up, we have a very, very brief feedback exercise. Lorene will pull up a poll that should show up on your screens. And if you can just take a couple of seconds to answer some of these multiple choice questions, they would be greatly helpful for us in bringing our community more topics of conversation like these. And so as you finish with that poll, I just want to thank you again. You're welcome to log off, or if anyone has any questions, I think we could stay on for a couple more minutes, but just thank you so much, everyone, for participating. We really appreciate it. And feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions or comments.
Well, I want to say, Shreena, I loved hearing you talk. Thank you so much. I love that you were just like, you have so much information and you kept telling us, and it's just fantastic. So thank you so much. I'm just really appreciative.
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting some more thank you messages. I'm not sure why the chat, it seems like it got set up privately or something. So I've got some that seem to be just be coming to me. Lindsay says, thank you, that was amazing.
That's always nice to hear. Yeah.
I'm also getting private messages like, thanks so much, such an important conversation. This was amazing. When is Shreena's book coming out, and where do you recommend we order it from?
I hope next year, and from your local bookstore.
Yeah.
My local bookstore is a bookstore called Schuler's that I try to get my books from. Yeah, when Amazon first started, I think I was in college, and it was like this amazing thing, you know, because it was only books, and so, you know, but then it just kind of went on steroids or something.
For those of you who are still here, we're sending a follow-up email to all those who registered with links to Shreena's work, as well as links to Living Yoga's Social Justice Culture Initiative, where you can, again, like I said, you can sign up for free, and we send monthly prompts and resources and discussion prompts for you for self-study, or if you want to form a affinity group. So.
Yeah, I like the terminology you use there of affinity group, especially because I do think that for the white folks in the room that's still left, people of color censor themselves when talking about race in some ways to white people. We censor ourselves when talking to other groups of color, right? And so I think, again, like after the election of Donald Trump in 2017, like one of my friend's husbands told me, why don't you go to West Virginia and like talk to the coal miners and get them to vote Democratic next time? And I was like, in what universe will a coal miner in West Virginia listen to me? Right? And I was like, you're from West Virginia. You should be going down to West Virginia and talking to coal miners. But I think there's something really powerful and I think really ethical, and it's our responsibility to talk to our own communities and point out where our faults, right, and how we can be better, right? I am constantly talking to my family, my community about anti-Black racism, and, you know, as I said, South Asia has a patriarchy problem. There are, you know, too many sex-selective abortions happening in South Asian communities globally, right? So we have less women or less girl babies than we have boy babies, right? And that's becoming a problem in South Asia. You know, there was like a mayor in Punjab a few years ago who ran on the platform, if you elect me, I'll find you wives. That's how bad the problem is there, right? And so that's something that I know I can talk to my community about and say, we can be better, right? If a white person talks to the South Asian community about that, it's taken in a wrong way. It's taken in a kind of a colonizing way, and there's a resistance to that, right? And so similarly, if I go to a white person and say, you know, you need to work on your racism, it doesn't work the same way as if a white person did it. So I really like the idea of affinity groups because it allows people to talk to people more openly and more freely and more honestly.
Yeah. Shreena, I got one last question. Do you want to take it, or do you want me to email?
Sure. And
okay. And I'd recognize anybody that wants to sign off, please go ahead. That Avery, Lorraine, I know we're past time. But the question is, after the question is, after everything you've brought to mind, like the caste system, language, consumerism, westernization of yoga, etc., as a practitioner of yoga, what can I do to honor the origin and true practice of yoga, in your opinion?
I mean, as I said, I would say the best way to honor it is use it not just to better yourself, but to better society, right? And that's what I really love about when you guys were talking about living yoga, like using yoga to help people who are incarcerated, right? That's when I think about the population in our, you know, detention facilities, in our prisons, right? They are treated the worst. They are dehumanized. You know, it's again something I can't understand because I've never had that experience, but being caged up for non-violent offenses is one of the sickest things about our society, even for, you know, violent. I mean, I don't know that I would call myself a prison abolitionist, but I do think something needs to be done in general, right? About prisons. So maybe I would call myself a prison abolitionist if I don't necessarily think they should exist. But the fact is they do exist, right? And going there and giving your time to them, I think is amazing, right? That to me is honoring the history of the part of yoga that is about liberation, that is about centering, you know, the self, humanizing the self, and seeing the human in the other, right? More than the word namaste, right? The word namaste is, you know, like a pretty picture, but actually going there and giving people who are incarcerated or giving people who are recovering from trauma in some way the tools to feel human and to feel whole, I think is pretty amazing, you know. And you don't need Sanskrit for that or namaste, but maybe Om.
And we still have a few people online with us. Did anyone have anything else to add or any other questions?
Just thank you so much for just a fantastic presentation.
Oh, you're
Really.
welcome, Anna. Is it Anna or Anna?
It's Anna.
Anna, okay.
Okay. Yeah, and we will have a recording and we'll be able to redistribute it. So fantastic.
Yes, absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciated everything. It was really thought-provoking.
Mm-hmm.
And I took notes and I will look on and think on later. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Shreena, someone's asking if you have a social media account that someone can follow you.
On Instagram, I mean, I'm both on Instagram and Twitter. Instagram is Shreena Nikita, and Twitter is the same. Instagram is where I tweet about the academy and racism and all that kind of stuff. And Instagram is where I post pictures of things I think are pretty.
I'm gonna put that in the chat box.
Yeah, you can go ahead. It's just
the same handle, Shreena Nikita. It's the same
handle. Yeah. And that's also my email, shreenanikita@gmail.com.
Well, thank you all again. Oh, Liz, yeah.
I just was saying bye, my battery's going. I just was, bye. Thank you. So sweet to see everybody.
Thanks for being here. Bye, Liz. Okay, there's lots of people here. All right, well, thanks everyone. We're gonna end the meeting. And like I said, if I didn't answer your questions, I've saved everything in the chat, so we'll work to answer some of those. So thanks everyone. Thanks, Shreena.
You're welcome. You want me to stay just a minute to debrief, you said?
So I think we can end the meeting and maybe rejoin. Or, oh no, people are, actually folks are, yeah, we can stay.
Okay. I think what you can do is just stop recording, and maybe the people who are still here just don't realize that we've ended the meeting.